On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, the government shutdown begins. What's closed, what's open, and how to prepare now for getting back to business eventually. Welcome to FedGov Today with Francis Rose. Waves of federal employees went into their offices Wednesday to turn in materials and turn off work because of the lapse in appropriations. Politico reports the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vought, told Republican members of Congress Wednesday that mass firings of federal employees would, quote, begin in a day or two. Mike McCord is former Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. Robert Shea is CEO of GovNavigators, former Associate Director for Administration and Government Performance at OMB. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. Robert, I start with you. What's the messaging that agencies should expect from OMB, both in the short term and the long term as the shutdown progresses?
You know, I could have answered that question more easily a couple of years ago, but OMB is taking such a different posture these days that it's hard to predict. They've been slow to apportion appropriated funds even before we were talking about a shutdown. So agencies that expected normal funding to be provided, they're having to wait and sometimes not being given the full story on just when to expect those things. This time they've also not posted contingency plans as they traditionally have. Agencies are left to post their own shutdown contingency plans. And then, of course, OMB warned agencies that there may be reductions in force, permanent terminations of individuals whose programs don't fit the president's priorities. Those are all very new, and whether or not they are threats to pressure Democrats to support a continuing resolution or real, we're going to find out.
Mike, welcome. It's great to have you here. What's the message that a CFO should be sending to the people right around him or her and to the people further down the chain during a time like this?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would say as a former CFO, former senior leader, I want to first start by communicating my support and sympathy to the civil servants who are impacted by this through no fault of their own. So the primary harm is in a shutdown is that psychological and financial harm to the employees and the message that they're receiving implicitly that neither the importance of their work or the fact that they have bills to pay, neither of those things motivates their leaders to get funding done and get a lapse. The second kind of harm is to the taxpayers, right? Because they're not getting the services they pay taxes for already during the shutdown, and there's waste, there's inefficiency, there's work piling up, that kind of thing. In terms of communicating to your staff, there's sort of three levels, I think. A lot of it should have been done beforehand, right? The lapse plans that Robert referred to, those are written documents. There should be a message from your agency head that all the employees can see where the secretary of their agency is coming from. Second level is a lot before, but also during, there should be verbal communication of the senior leaders who are accepted and still at work. So everybody's on the same page about what is happening on any given day, and that can then be disseminated down the different chains, and the CFO at DOD is the person who honchos that effort. Third thing then is that there are things that are government-wide that agencies don't make up their own. And that's where you should be looking to the OPM website in particular. Number one question you always get right for new employees is, my health insurance terminated during a shutdown? And that's an example of, you might think that because we get close to these fairly often and they have happened before, that everybody knows how they work. Not true at all. And I would say, just from where I was at DOD missed the last really long shutdown in the first Trump administration about 6 years ago. It's been 12 years since DOD had this. No military leader is in the same job they were 12 years ago. Many of the employees weren't in the government at all 12 years ago, and very few civilian leaders who are on the job today were in the same job. So you certainly should not assume that people know how it works because it's happened at some time before. So that's why the communication, as you say, is very important.
From a CFO perspective, where do you go to look for where funds might be available to stretch this out as long as possible for as many people as possible?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think if you think in the framework of your personal life, my income got cut off, I'm going to rely on my savings it doesn't work that way here very well. There is no live, as we say, live appropriation to pay people or operate the department that exists today. So there's nothing to pour money into if you had it. There also, agencies don't keep cash on hand to a large extent. There is some at DoD in so-called working capital funds. It's set aside for specific tasks. So there really isn't a lot of moving money around. Reprogramming, for example, is not as helpful as one might think because there are no valid operating appropriations to move money into. So this is more about you are running up obligations the government will have to pay later, and hopefully you're doing those for the right things, the accepted activities, the priority activities for life, safety, property. But it's not about how much money do I have to get through this because you don't have any.
Mm-hmm. Robert, something you didn't say explicitly, but that I took away from your comments earlier. This shutdown's different than anything we've experienced over the last 15 or 20 years in this sector. What specifically, from a management perspective, is different that could cause a different outcome potentially when the people who are coming back to work actually do come back to work?
Well, remember, we've had massive downsizing since the beginning of the transition to the Trump administration. So most agencies are already working at a significantly lower FTE level than when the shutdown began. And now we've got another 500,000 people who have been furloughed, with the threat of additional people or some subset of that being terminated permanently. Terminating workforces permanently, whole program staffs, will make it extremely difficult to rebuild those workforces. It's already difficult when a shutdown ends to bring back people to restore their pay and benefits. This will make it even more difficult, I think.
Is it at least a positive that the folks that are furloughed know when they come back they will get paid? That's a law now. That is different than last time.
That's right, though might they be terminated permanently? So I think Mike's point that there's a human toll here, the stress imposed on our friends across the federal government is significant. So I'm not sure it's a great comfort just to know that they might get these benefits when in fact they might actually be terminated permanently.
A more basic, I guess, managerial question that I'll ask to either one of you. If I'm accepted, so I'm still working, but I have people on my team that are not, and they're furloughed, how do I communicate with them? How do I know what I can do and what I can't do to tell them what's going on or to even tell them when to come back to work?
From my perspective, again, that's something you should have covered with folks as you saw this, the ship approaching the iceberg.
Yeah.
But if things are happening government-wide, I would say, shutdown's going to end, shutdown's going to continue. You've got a lot of sources, right? The Washington Post and Politico and Roll Call are going to tell you that. If you want to see official, right, you're looking at OPM and OMB, probably websites for operating status and things like that. If it's about you personally, your status is being changed for some reason during the shutdown. I think then management has an obligation to communicate with you, directly, personally by the phone, since you're not supposed to be using your government email. It needs to be more direct one-on-one communication if there's something about your status that is different from his status.
What are the risks that you see for agencies as they're out trying to get back to work? A lot of focus on the shutdown, and there should be, but I'm not sure that we do a good enough job of helping people prepare. Eventually, hopefully, these people will be coming back to work and getting back to the business at hand. What are the risks that they should expect to see in your view?
Well, their peers might have been permanently terminated. Contracts that were paused will need to be reinstated. All the work that stopped as a result of the shutdown will have to begin again. We will have lost time. Contractors can't be expected to keep the same people on staff if they're not getting paid. So those are just a couple of the risks I see. And then we've got the prospect of another shutdown. What gets agreed to won't be a full year budget. So we will be facing in pretty short order just another shutdown.
The 36-day shutdown, I think it was, in 2019, the residual impact that I kept hearing about after that one, Mike, was what Robert just alluded to. My team came back. The contractor workforce that supported us looked completely different because of the churn that he just described. What impact could that potentially have on the people who are coming back to work and the way that they interact with the contracting base?
Yeah, and I think you're right. The key word is interacting, right? Because the contract may have valid funds that are multi-year funds at DoD. That's the case. That probably is at other agencies. But if there's not available people to supervise, then things are going to fall through the cracks and stop. And as Robert said, it's lost time that you're not going to get back, and probably cost increases. I wouldn't expect to see, and I don't think we've seen in the past, contracts wholesale canceled because of a lapse. But you're going to, it's more of that kind of hard to put a dollar figure on sometimes for the taxpayer, but that waste that is kind of hidden, but is there.
Is this an event that is worthy of what is very common in the Defense Department, an after-action report? Is it worth, once people get back to the office, sitting down and saying, let's review and document what we experienced in the event that what Robert alluded to happens again, that we turn around and we're in the same situation, either in short order or in the long term?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And when you do come back after one of these, what are you going to find if you're the management of them? I saw this when I was there 12 years ago. We had a lapse. It was actually the second furlough in the same year. If you remember, 2013, not a great year. We had a Budget Control Act sequester, which led to furloughs at DoD, and then months later, a second, because of a lapse, furlough, only 6 months after the previous one. So morale plummeted. That's what I think when you come back, you'll find this mixture of relief to be back at work, depending on, as Robert says, whether the solution is a 1-week solution or a permanent solution or something in between, mixed with a loss of morale, a loss of trust, and questions will be asked not only by your management, by your team, by your staff, about any perceived discrepancies of fairness. Like if the Army civilian was treated differently than the Navy civilian who appear to have similar jobs, why was that? Why wasn't I treated the way he was? So I think that to your point, after action can be useful not just for the management, but also might be sort of required, because you're going to get, as a manager, questions, and you're going to have people who are looking at you differently now that they've been furloughed.
Robert, very quick final thought. Any expectations for what happens, as Mike talked about, when these people come back to work?
Well, they're going to lose all those vendors who are promising free sandwiches for furloughed employees. No, I mean, I'm kidding, but I think the idea of studying what happened, what should we have done differently to make this a little bit of a softer hit, would be time well spent, and being ready to employ those when the next threat of a shutdown occurs, which may be right upon us.
Robert, Mike, it's great to have both of you here. Thanks very much for joining me today. You can read more on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, not everything's closed, at least not yet. FedGov Today with Francis Rose. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You heard Mike McCord and Robert Shea reference that not everything in the federal government will be closed during the shutdown. Some offices will stay open, at least for a little while. Sonny Hashmi is head of global public sector at Uncork and former chief information officer, former commissioner of the Federal Acquisition Service at the General Services Administration. Jim Williams is president of Jim Williams Consulting, former acting administrator at GSA. Gentlemen, welcome. Great to see both of you. Jim, I start with you as not just a veteran of GSA, but of the IRS, the Department of Homeland Security. How does one know who might still be working, who might be accepted, and who might not be during the shutdown?
Well, I think OMB is pretty much leaving that to the discretion of the individual agencies. And I think right now about a quarter of the employees maybe are being told stay home. And the ones who are accepted are generally those who are involved in the protection of national security, life, property, as well as those that still have funding that will carry them. As you said, for a while anyway, if the funding lasts, they'll continue to work. For those where the funding starts to run short, they'll eventually have to be furloughed. And there's, the ones who are accepted who are working or exempt, the ones who are furloughed, and then the ones who are intended to be RIFed. And I think, the ones that are at the far end that might be RIFed, they're at the most danger of losing their jobs. And I have to say that every employee I've talked to wants to work. They talk about the mission. They don't want to have problems with their mission. They want to go back to work.
We'll come back to the RIF issue in just a moment. Sonny, welcome. It's great to have you on the program again. The folks that are staying there and the leaders who are leading them, what would you like to see? What are the best practices, if such a thing exists, for keeping those folks engaged and keeping them on task during a time of kind of tumult like this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Francis. So the one thing to remember and note right away is that this is not business as usual. When you're operating in a shutdown, even in agencies that have funding, even in agencies and programs that are largely unaffected, they're not performing all of the duties that they typically would perform. They're only allowed to perform those very specific tasks and functions that are deemed to be accepted, as in they are directly responsible for maintaining life and protection of life and liberty, national security, and other tasks such as that. So immediately there is lots of questions, and the leadership needs to provide as much information as possible to those folks who are authorized and responsible for continuing to work on exactly what functions they are allowed to continue to perform and which ones will be paused. It's also very important to become really close friends with your CFO and your general counsel right now, because this is the environment where it's very easy to get afoul of the anti-deficiency law or even the Hatch Act. Making sure that the communication at the employee level stays neutral, making sure that as an employee you continue to abide by the rules of engagement, rules of regulations, and then also making sure that your CFO and your general counsel can very clearly articulate which functions are allowed to continue to operate and which ones don't. Lastly, every agency, even programs that are continuing to operate, will work in isolation from other groups that typically support them. So your program may be unaffected, but the procurement shop may not be running at full capacity. Your IT shop may not be running at full capacity. So understand that your function will be affected in some ways, small or large, and then coming up with contingency strategies on how to continue to operate in that environment, where you can't initiate procurements or hire people or conduct some IT work. How are you going to continue to operate in that environment in the absence of those services being fully available?
Sonny knows what I'm always interested in talking about, Jim. Who else would you recommend besides CFO, General Counsel, and the others that Sonny mentioned that people have really close relationships with through the shutdown?
Well, I think it's probably also the Chief Human Capital Officer. Those are the people who are still there processing the actions. I think if there's an employee assistance program, you probably want to make that available. But really, I look to the leaders because that's who the people turn to. And I used this analogy a while ago. It's probably not a great analogy, but D-Day, there were men trying to take the beach, and they watched their leaders fall, their compatriots fall, yet they still had a mission. And somebody had to pick up that baton and say, we still got a job to do. And as much as, in the face of withering criticism, you still have to deliver on the government's mission. There are people who count on the government to do that. So I really look to whoever the leaders are today to do everything they can to keep morale high, to keep people focused. And that's easy to say. I've never been through this kind of turmoil and change. But I think it's time for leaders. And I do like that this administration actually had an empathetic comment about federal employees, said they're working people with families. They are, and they care. They work hard, and they're going to continue to deliver, and they should support each other.
You said a moment ago that the agencies would have some discretion as far as what's accepted and what is not. How would you, if you're in that chair as the secretary, the deputy secretary, making those decisions, how would you determine what's accepted and what's not? And how would you determine what the financial status of the agency is to determine how long some of those folks might be able to keep going?
Well, I think that's where Sonny said, be close to your CFO. They're going to know the money situation, how long it can last. And as secretary, you always have to work in conjunction with the White House, with OMB, because they're giving overall direction here. But if you care about your mission, you're Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Homeland Security, you know you have some critical missions under you, and you better protect those missions. I like the fact that they're continuing to let the IRS perform, one of my old agencies, because they know with tax season coming up, this is very, very critical. I mean, that's the engine that fuels America's government. So I think the secretaries have to look at their missions and say, what is it that's critical to the American people that we continue to perform?
When I think about risk, Sonny, during a shutdown, the first thing I go to is to the cyber risk that the federal government might undertake. An organization like CISA, I read, is overwhelmingly furloughed. A lot of folks there are not working right now, and so on. What are the other risks that you see across the landscape, particularly in the technology sector?
Yeah, that's a fine place to start, right? Cybersecurity risk, like our enemies don't sleep. Our adversaries are not on furlough, right? So they will continue to probe and find entry points, and we have to stay vigilant and protect. And so that's typically when you look at an IT shop, usually cybersecurity team, or at least cyber ops teams will be the first ones on the list of accepted resources. And oftentimes that work is outsourced also. So one of the things that people don't often realize is that it's not just about feds being furloughed, but there's a whole conversation around contracts. Which contracts continue to operate, which contracts have the exception and requirement to continue to show up. Others have to, some contractors may have to work at will, some contractors may have to work with deferred invoicing. So there's a whole bunch of complexity around this. But ultimately the same kind of decision making happens there too. Which contracts have to stay operational to continue to provide that service. But other risks involved around are, there's a significant amount of disruption. People just leaving and coming back. Their accounts have to be activated, deactivated. So there's a certain amount of dysfunction that happens both at the beginning of the shutdown, but also soon after reconstitution or like after appropriations have been agreed to, because all of that work falls down to procurement. A lot of the procurement activity, for example, will be paused. So any procurement, like we're at the end of the fiscal year. This is the busiest time for procurement shops typically, that they're doing contract extensions, renewals, recompetitions, they're doing RFIs, they're doing market research. All of that work typically gets paused, right? So when you come back, that backlog has not gone away. Now you have to do all of that work and catch up. And so there's a lot of that risk around, will mistakes happen? Will shortcuts be taken? Will there be audit concerns and issues downstream? So again, that becomes challenging to kind of really do in a professional way. And lastly, during this time, because even missions that are operational will be working at reduced capacity, there will always be risk of process risk, right? Are things going to fall through the cracks? Are things going to take longer than they typically do? Are SLAs going to be missed? And what is that going to look like 3, 4, 5 months from now, looking back on what are the causes for some of those kind of things that may not have gone to plan during this time?
Yeah.
I'd just like to support what Sonny said. I mean, our enemies don't sleep. As he said, they'll probe the vulnerabilities. If we didn't learn that from 9/11, shame on us. They look for the loopholes, the ways they could exploit to attack us. And we've got a number of big events coming up in this country. We've got FIFA, the World Cup soccer, that's going to have 80 separate events in U.S. cities alone. We've got America 250 coming up July 4th next year, with celebrations planned all over the country. And the preparations for that are going on right now. And I hope that those things don't come to a halt. Because again, those are things that make our nation most vulnerable. Just this shutdown looks like instability, but certainly, as Sonny said, looking at CISA, they haven't even renewed the CISA law. That's critical that be renewed. But the cyber threats, as you know, are millions per day. So we need to have people constantly engage in those threats that are increasing.
Jim, we just have a couple of minutes left. Sonny referenced acquisition and the workforce there. My LinkedIn last Tuesday was loaded with people saying, hey, today's my last day in the federal government. I took the DRP. I'm leaving. A lot of those folks were acquisition folks. What do you expect to see in those acquisition shops when things reopen again and the workforce looks different? There's a backlog, as Sonny referenced, and all of these issues stacking up.
Well, I think there's a promise that AI can help deal with what was the acquisition burden, but that only goes to a certain extent. I think the government's going to need to hire acquisition people back. And I also want to support what Sonny said. The contractors are an integral part of our workforce. We need to pay attention. They are the partners, and there are dedicated people who work for these contractors, and they need acquisition officials to help manage their contracts. I mean, they're going to have start up again. If they have a stop work order, you need acquisition people to do that. So I think more and more, as we rely upon the contractor workforce, we've got to have good acquisition people and a sufficient number to manage them well.
Jim, Sonny, it's great to have both of you on the program. Thanks very much for joining me. You can read more about the shutdown on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. FedGov Today will be back in just a moment. Welcome back. You'll stay updated on what you need to know about the shutdown with special editions of the FedGov Today podcast this week. You can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your shows, and always on demand at fedgovtoday.com. FedGov Today TV returns next Sunday morning at 10:30. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a great week.